When I realised my upload schedule sat squarely between Remembrance Sunday and International Men's Day, I knew exactly what story I wanted to cover. Fans of Sabaton have probably heard the song 500,000 times. Full disclosure, I sobbed my heart out at parts of researching this script, and I wasn't crying because I was sad. One of the things I try to do on my TikTok and on this channel is show that human beings, beyond all else, are insanely evil. I tried to show the negative side of freedom fighters, and as much as I love Boudica, my controversial TikTok showing how she killed 70,000 people in Londinium, yet this story is one of those rare moments in human history when the human condition truly shines through. This is the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown. Yeah, you did just hear Sabaton. Yeah, they did say I could use their song in this video. It's time for the sponsor, because we're doing it at the start of the video, and as always, who is the sponsor for this gigantic YouTube channel? It's me! When is it not me? So you know the drill, check out my link tree to view any links that could help you support me. I have a Discord, go on that, that's getting lively now. It's mainly people occasionally asking me about history stuff. Support me on Patreon. I have a merch store in the US and the UK. My book is obviously still available on Amazon, and if enough people buy it, then I'll finish the sequel. Biggest of all, if you could like, subscribe, and share, it would get my work out there, and that's what I need more than anything, is for people to see it. I did have a Jake Paul boxing joke written again. I haven't done that because I feel like the more I do it, the more I'm going to manifest it. At some point in my life, I'm going to end up actually having to box Jake Paul. And I don't want to run the risk of losing to Jake Paul. On the 20th of December 1943, an American B-17 bomber known as Ye Olde Pub flies 20,000 feet above the North Sea as part of an 8-mile-long bomber stream. These bombers are targeting a Vogel aircraft factory in the city of Bremen in North Germany. I will add on, the man piloting this had 10 other lives under his wing, and that man was Charlie Brown.
Good old Charlie Brown.
Yes, like the cartoon. He was just 21. I turned 24 in December. I can't even drive. The crewmen on this plane belonged to the 379th Bombardment Group. Shortly after 11 AM, the Allied forces crossed the German border. Eventually the clouds give way and Germany comes into view. Now, this moment is good because they can see their intended target. The intended target and all its defences can also see them. Anti-aircraft gunners begin expertly calculating their height, speed, and intended destination. But the bombers weren't completely undefended, as they had P-47 Thunderbolts guarding them, although their main objective was to hunt down enemy fighters, rather than stick with the bombers and protect them. At 11:30 AM, German flak gunners begin firing upon the bomber stream. Puffs of black smoke appear around the planes, and most of these have a differently timed fuse, so the air around Charlie is very quickly covered in thick black smoke, obscuring his vision and that of most of the other pilots. Suddenly, a red flash explodes in front of the plane, and the plexiglass nose shears off and smashes into the windscreen. There's now a massive hole in the front of the plane, and the window isn't going to be covered by auto glass repair, we'll put it like that. This didn't actually hurt anyone, but freezing cold winds of minus 60 degrees Celsius, or minus 76 degrees Fahrenheit if you're an American, come flying and pouring into the aircraft. Another red flash sees Engine 2 on the left wing completely fail. This is followed by a third shell that pierces one of the wings, damaging it further and leaving Charlie to wrestle with his plane. This is only the beginning, as on the right wing, engine number 4 is severely damaged and begins to spin wildly out of control, threatening to rip the wing off of the plane. Above all else, at this point in the mission, Charlie's main focus is keeping the plane straight and on target when the order to drop their payload is given. Once this is done, the formation turns back towards the North Sea, away from the burning city and a burning Germany. You'd think now, as the plane begins to turn back, although severely damaged, it's a moment of respite for Charlie and his crew. Yet, as they turned around and scanned the skies nervously for enemy fighters, they noticed that the Germans aren't in the air. But neither's their escort.
Some foreshadowing there.
Charlie and his crew quickly realise they are at the back of the herd, and they are limping and they are wounded. Now, none of the bombers actually made it out of the attack unscathed, but Ye Olde Pub and another plane actually took the brunt of the attack. The other plane is dangerously losing height and smoke is pouring out of its engines. Charlie's plane isn't in a much better condition with only 2 functional engines at this point.
Foreshadowing.
The other B-17 dives in a desperate attempt to put out its fire, yet as it dives below the clouds, there is a simple red flash. Instead of the other plane coming out of the clouds, Charlie can only gasp in horror as his co-pilot screams, "Bandits." At this point from in front of them, a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s approach. Then, leaping from the clouds below, not like a deer in a Disney movie, like a panther, or a panzer, if you will. A group of Messerschmitt Bf 109s now chase Ye Olde Pub from behind. Charlie's men prep the machine guns as the 2 lead 190s now aim for the cockpit. This is to take out the pilot and the cockpit in one fell swoop. In an act of bravery, or perhaps just pure desperation, Charlie turns the plane straight at the enemy fighters. However, there is some logic to this, as it limits the target that the 190s have, but it also shortens the distance between them. This confuses the attackers, who then go on to miss entirely. Charlie's top gunner manages to take out one of the 190s, which crashes in a ball of red flame. The nose gunner takes out the second while it attempts to avoid collision. The 109s then close in directly from behind while the tail gunner moves to intercept, yet his gun won't turn. It is frozen solid from the freezing cold winds that have been blowing through the plane for the last however long. Charlie's tail gunner then realises that the plane is defenceless from the rear. The tail gunner then signals to Charlie, who then jerks the plane into a steep dive in a desperate attempt to avoid the enemy fighters. Bullets ricochet off the frame, penetrating the glass ball of the turret underneath the plane and cutting off the left-hand side of the rudder. At this point, the radio operator is desperately calling for help but is met with only static. This is because the German fighters and the anti-aircraft shells have almost entirely destroyed the plane, destroying systems such as the hydraulics and the radio. In fact, Sergeant Alex Alescano has almost had his leg entirely blown off, and at this point is held on by a few tendons. If you hadn't guessed, that's quite painful. Things are now in absolute dire straits, as this point in the mission has left most of Charlie's crew injured and his tail gunner has sadly died. With only one gun left to defend them, the next attack sees the cockpit hit, and this punctures Charlie's oxygen tank. And to really rub salt into the wound, Engine 3 is also struck during the attack. Although not completely destroyed, it leaves only one engine working at full capacity. Finally succumbing to its wounds, the bomber begins to tip to the left and spiral to the ground. All that Charlie can do is gasp for air while he desperately tries to regain control of his failing aircraft. The bomber then proceeds to plummet to the ground for almost 4 miles, and at one point even flips upside down. Due to injury, a lack of oxygen, and presumably G-forces, Charlie by this point has passed out. Yet, as the bomber nears the city of Oldenburg by a miracle, Charlie comes to. Charlie hauls at the controls, and at around 3,000 feet, or just under 1,000 metres, Charlie manages to pull the plane out of its dive, feeling the tips of trees brush against the undercarriage of the B-17. Ironically, this terrifying moment was probably a saving grace for the crew of Ye Olde Pub. As it spiralled to the ground, the German fighters had no reason to follow it and presumed that everyone on board was dead or about to be. Now, despite all this B-17 really had earned its name of a flying fortress, but was only able to fly 135 miles per hour, or 217 kilometres per hour. This should be the happy bit, but in order to get back to England and land safely, Charlie and his crew have to pass the Atlantic Wall. Those who are familiar with World War II history will know that the Atlantic Wall is one of the most fortified coastlines of all time. With all those big guns protecting the beach, you can't help but think that Mr. Hitler might have been compensating a little bit.
Hitler has only got one wall.
Now, Mr. Brown was well aware that he'd been off to town on the A21, but getting home that evening might not have been on the cards. With this in mind, he gives the opportunity for all of his crew members to bail out and become POWs, which, although not exactly the best way to spend WW2, it's a lot better than plummeting to the ground and splatting. To Charlie's surprise, not a single crew member took him up on that offer. Franz was a German flying ace. His father was a pilot in World War I and his brother was a pilot in World War II. Franz and his brother grew up in a desperate Germany that was being filled with the promises of a politician who would become one of the most hated men in all of history. Sadly, Franz's brother would be shot down and this would cause Franz himself to enlist. Franz would find himself in Africa under the command of Gustav Rodel, who would teach him a strict code of conduct. This code of conduct is quoted verbatim as, "If I ever see you shooting down a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by the rules to keep your humanity." Franz would also fly with the Knights of the Desert and watch the destruction of the Afrika Korps. Eventually he would find himself in the desperate defence of Sicily with Adolf Galland.
From down below, one enemy spotted, so hurry up, rearm and refuel.
Now, with Franz's backstory in mind, we move back to Charlie and his crew, who at this point have just flown past Yavor Airfield. Now, by chance, Franz Stigler had just finished refuelling his plane. He'd already brought down a B-17 a day earlier and was incredibly close to being awarded the Knight's Cross. He just needed one more B-17. And as he looked up at the sky, he saw one. Franz immediately jumps into his Messerschmitt 109 and gets into the air, closing incredibly quickly on the flying fortress. Yet as he approaches the bomber with his finger on the trigger, something stops him from firing. Franz quickly realises that the B-17 hasn't opened fire upon him. Against his instinct, he flies closer to investigate. Immediately, he sees the absolute destruction that the plane has suffered, and it's quoted as saying he was shocked to see it still flying. Stigler is directly quoted as saying, "I knew the tail gunner wasn't there because the guns were hanging down. Half the tail was missing on the left-hand side. Frankly, no tail at all." Upon seeing Charlie and his crew, he was reminded of that code of conduct that he had had instilled in him back in Africa. Another quote from Stigler shows what was going through his mind. "It's hard to describe an aeroplane that's so crippled. And for me, it would have been the same as shooting at a parachute. I just couldn't shoot." Things were incredibly different from Charlie's perspective. I look out my right window and there, parked on my wing, is a German Bf 109. Just would be my reaction too. He goes on to say, "So I closed my eyes and shut my head as you would if you was having a nightmare. And if I close my eyes and open them again, he'll be gone." Well, when I opened them again, he was still there. Charlie has openly admitted in other interviews that, and I quote verbatim, "I was scared and I don't give a damn who knows it." If I was in his position, I'd have been touching cloth too. As Franz continued to fly alongside Charlie's plane, he was reminded of his brother and how he was shot down. At this point, Franz makes the first of some key decisions that would perhaps change the course of events that day. Franz waves at Charlie and then points down, attempting to get him to fly and land in neutral Sweden and perhaps survive the war as a prisoner of war. Charlie flat out refused this offer, although in a later interview he would admit if he'd actually understood what Franz was offering, he probably would have accepted. Franz, however, in that original moment realised that the pilot wouldn't go down without a fight and everyone on board would most likely die. Unless they had help. Making an educated guess, Franz decides to stay with them as they approach the Atlantic Wall. You see, the experienced German spotters should be able to spot one of their own, and all Franz had to do was look like he was giving chase and get the old pub past the AA guns. Not fully understanding what Franz was doing, Charlie orders his last working gun to be pointed at the Messerschmitt Bf 109, in case it does try something. When they reach the Atlantic Wall and as they fly over the anti-aircraft guns, not a single one of them fires. Charlie is confused by this until Franz salutes him and then turns around. In the words of Sabaton, a short salute and then departed. Charlie and his crew just make it back to England on the skin of their teeth, landing at the nearest airfield rather than their own.
Just this once! Everybody lives!
Their commanding officer goes to give them medals for their service that day, but High Command quickly gets wind of the event and classifies the entire mission. This is because the idea of a friendly or a helpful German fighter pilot completely derails propaganda and could lower morale as a whole. Franz too was, although by himself, sworn to silence. Charlie recounts the precarious nature of the situation. If someone had seen him and reported him, it could have been a death sentence, a double, so he had the double impact. This is because not only did Franz have the risk of someone on the ground from his own side seeing him and reporting him in Nazi Germany, he also had the risk that at any point, Charlie and his crew could open fire. By sheer coincidence, the two men ended up settling around 200 miles apart from each other. Franz would eventually settle in Vancouver, in British Columbia, in Canada, while Charlie would settle in Seattle, in Washington, in the US of A.
Fuck yeah!
In 1985, Boeing invited old fighter pilots and old bomber pilots to the 50th anniversary of the B-17. Franz attended and was pretty much the only German pilot there. I wonder why. Franz, however, would finally get the chance to tell someone other than his wife about the story of the men he saved that day when a local TV station decided to interview him. In the same year, Charlie was reaching out to the German magazine Jägerblatt and Franz's old commanding officer, Adolf Galland. He explained he was trying to find the man who'd saved him all those years ago, but these investigations turned up nothing. Finally, in 1990, the two old pilots were reunited, exchanging copious amounts of letters and having various phone calls. They would get to meet in person again in 1995. When asked how it felt to see Charlie, Franz said, "I was so happy I just hugged him." He then went on to say it wasn't easy. Holding back tears, he follows that up with, "I love you, Charlie." Charlie said it was like seeing a family member or a brother you hadn't seen in 40 years. In a separate interview, Franz's wife actually said how much he loved Canada, and when invited to a reunion of the 379th Bomber Group, Franz was greeted as a hero. However, you remember at the start when I said that most humans are evil, and I try and show that because I don't want people to believe that there was good guys and bad guys. That's not what history is. History is full of people doing mostly bad things, and I make light of that and bring a humorous spin to it and try and teach history. Well, someone had to ruin this very nice story. Once the story broke, Franz began receiving phone calls and letters from people in Germany calling him a traitor to the fatherland. On the other side of this, Franz had Canadians shouting abuse at him and calling him a Nazi. But he had the perfect comeback, because he simply said, in a calm voice, they would never understand. When asked about the fact that he never received his Knight's Cross, Franz made a simple statement: I received something much better. Franz would give Charlie a book which read, in 1940 I lost my only brother as a night fighter. On the 20th of December, 4 days before Christmas, I had the chance to save a B-17 from her destruction. A plane so badly damaged, it was a wonder she was still flying. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother Franz.
It's enough to make a grown man cry.
What shocked me was the pure regret they both shared, and the fact that they have to put at the back of their mind the fact that they most likely killed off each other's friends and colleagues. And I'm obviously glad that there are no aggressive governments in the world who could risk something like that happening again. Just 8 months apart, in 2008, Franz and Charlie would take one final journey into the skies. If anything, the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown serves as a reminder that just because we're told to hate someone doesn't mean it's true. And whilst I, like every other historian, is appalled at the actions of the Nazi Party and the SS, it takes time to remember the individuals who didn't fight for those ideals, who fought because, like Franz, they saw it as their duty and a matter of survival. As a side note, my favourite story out of all of this is the fact that Franz Stigler's grandson is a massive Sabaton fan and was listening to Sabaton's new album at the time. Heroes has been out for a while now. But when he heard No Bullets Fly, which is the song that is based off of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, he immediately told his mother, Jovita Stigler, Franz's daughter. She then contacted the band and they met in Vancouver. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. And it's the one that I've had requested more than anything. You might want to get a lighter, because I hear that the snakes are smoking.